The sterile scent of antiseptic scrubbed at my nose, a stark contrast to the opulent silk robe I was wearing, a garment that suddenly felt absurdly out of place. I watched my father's hand, a landscape of gnarled knuckles and liver-spotted skin, tremble as he signed the papers. It was a gesture so casual, so dismissive, so utterly lacking in gravitas. It felt like he was signing a grocery list, not the death warrant for everything I'd spent years meticulously building brick by painstaking brick. The weight of the silence in that sterile, air-conditioned room, a silence thick with unspoken accusations and a lifetime of his ingrained expectations, was almost suffocating. He looked at me then, not with the warmth of paternal pride I'd always hoped for, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a landlord assessing a delinquent tenant who had overstayed their welcome, and uttered the words that would, I knew even then, echo in the hollows of my mind for years to come. Pay it back or get out. That was the moment the world as I knew it tilted. My father, a man whose entire edifice of success had been built on a foundation of ruthless pragmatism, a man who believed in leverage and leverage alone, had decided it was time for his prodigal son to finally contribute. Not with gratitude, not with appreciation for the gilded opportunities he'd so liberally provided, but with a demand. A purely financial demand that felt less like a request and more like an irrevocable ultimatum. A debt called in with the stark finality of a gavel strike. For years I'd been the quiet recipient of his seemingly endless financial support, a meticulously crafted safety net that allowed me to take the calculated risks, to pursue my own independent ventures, to stumble, to fail and crucially, to learn without the immediate, gnawing threat of utter ruin. He'd always framed it, in his own inimitable way, as an investment, a paternal loan to be repaid when I was established. I'd interpreted that to mean when my businesses were stable, when I had achieved a solid, undeniable footing in the professional arena. He apparently meant when he, in his own inscrutable wisdom, decided he wanted his money back, with interest regardless of my actual, on-the-ground circumstances. The first few days immediately following that pronouncement were a disorienting blur of sheer panic and profound disbelief. I'd always harbored an unwavering belief in my own abilities, in the intricate web of businesses I'd painstakingly cultivated from nascent ideas. They were, in my eyes, my creations, my intellectual property, born from countless sleepless nights and a relentless, all-consuming dedication. But they weren't instant cash-generating machines, machines that could, at a moment's notice, churn out the substantial sum he was now demanding. My ventures were, by their very nature, long-term plays, built on the delicate foundations of trust, an unassailable reputation and carefully nurtured, almost sacred relationships, not on liquid assets that could be readily and instantaneously liquidated. When I'd attempted to explain this, to lay out my meticulously crafted projections, my ambitious growth strategies, he'd waved my earnest explanations away with an impatient, almost contemptuous flick of his wrist. I don't care about your spreadsheets, son. I need my money. Now. The finality in his tone, the absolute refusal to engage with my reality, was like a cold slap across the face. The pressure, insidiously at first, then with increasing intensity, began to mount. My father, usually a man of precisely measured words and controlled demeanor, became noticeably, almost alarmingly, agitated. He'd call multiple times a day, his voice on the other end of the line tight with a barely suppressed, simmering anger. He started involving my mother, subtly at first, like a shadow lengthening across the room, then more overtly, pulling her into the fray. I could hear her sighing in the background of his calls, the weariness in her voice a silent, heartbreaking plea for me to comply, to de-escalate the palpable tension that was clearly fracturing their own hard-won peace. The rift, I realized with a growing dread, wasn't just between him and me anymore. It was spreading, a subtle, insidious poison seeping into the very fabric of our family dynamic. The house, once my sanctuary, my refuge from the storms of the outside world, began to feel like a gilded cage. Every interaction, every polite inquiry, was laced with an unspoken threat, a veiled judgment. Dinner conversations, which had always been a time for connection, for shared stories, now turned into thinly veiled interrogations about my financial status. Social gatherings, which had always been a point of immense pride for my father, a testament to his social standing and influence, were now shadowed by his veiled criticisms and pointed, almost accusatory questions about my progress. He'd make pronouncements about responsible stewardship and delayed gratification, words that, when uttered by him, felt less like gentle advice and more like direct accusations of irresponsibility and childishness. It was a deeply humiliating experience. I was a grown man, a businessman in my own right, forging my own path, yet I felt like a child being scolded for mismanaging his allowance, for not adhering to some arbitrary rule. The emotional toll, I discovered, was immense, a constant low-grade hum of anxiety that permeated every aspect of my existence. I found myself withdrawing, a natural instinct to self-protect. I started avoiding calls, fabricating increasingly elaborate excuses to skip family events. The resentment simmered, a low-grade fever that affected my sleep, my focus, my very ability to engage with the world. I'd lie awake at night, the digital clock on my bedside table casting a cold glow, replaying conversations in my mind, desperately searching for a loophole, a secret exit, a way out of this suffocating bind, but there was none. His demand was absolute, a monolithic wall I couldn't see over or around. It wasn't, I began to understand, about the money itself, not entirely. It was about the power dynamic, the assertion of control, the implicit brutal message that no matter how successful I became, no matter how far I soared, I would always be fundamentally indebted to him, eternally beholden to his whims and his often arbitrary dictates. The turning point, when it finally arrived, wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden, blinding epiphany, no fiery, cathartic declaration of independence. It was a slow, creeping realization that my continued struggle, my desperate attempts to appease him, was only perpetuating my own profound misery. My father's pronouncement had, in a single brutal stroke, stripped me of a certain deeply cherished illusion, the illusion that my eventual success would automatically earn his unconditional respect or, perhaps even more importantly, his genuine affection. He saw me not as an independent, fully formed entity, but as a mere extension of his own vast financial portfolio, a fluctuating asset to be managed and, if necessary, liquidated. The decision to finally act, to break free, wasn't born of a desire for petty retribution, but from a profound, primal need for self-preservation. I needed to reclaim my peace, my autonomy, the very essence of myself. I started by doing what I did best, what I had always done, planning. Quietly, meticulously, and with an almost monastic dedication, and crucially, without fanfare. I began the arduous process of disentangling myself from the businesses he had, in his mind, so generously funded. This wasn't about a desperate liquidation of assets to appease his demand. It was about ensuring their long-term survival, their absolute independence, separate from the suffocating shadow of his ever-present demand. I initiated discreet discussions with my key partners, explaining my personal situation with transparent honesty, without divulging the raw, hurtful, and frankly embarrassing details of my father's ultimatum. I carefully restructured agreements, strategically transferred ownership percentages where it made the most sense for long-term stability, and established trusts that would effectively insulate my ventures from any external financial pressures, including, most importantly, my father's. It was a complex, time-consuming process, requiring months of careful, often delicate negotiation and intricate legal maneuvering, a testament to the intricate nature of the businesses I had built. While this intricate financial restructuring was unfolding, I also began to consciously downsize my own life, shedding the external trappings of success that no longer served me. I sold possessions that were more about superficial status than genuine necessity, items that had once felt important but now felt like anchors. I moved out of the expansive, architecturally impressive apartment I'd been renting, opting for a smaller, more manageable, and ultimately more practical place. This wasn't a sign of financial failure, as my father might have perceived it, but of a deliberate, conscious redirection of resources. I stopped attending the lavish, often ostentatious industry events that my father so clearly enjoyed hosting and attending, citing prior commitments or, more honestly, a simple preference for smaller, more intimate gatherings where genuine connection could occur. When he would inquire about my absence, I'd offer polite, unassailable reasons that deflected without revealing anything substantive. The true payoff, the subtle shift in the power dynamic, began not with a grand dramatic gesture, but with a series of small, almost imperceptible shifts in behavior and perception. My father, so accustomed to the constant, tangible pressure he exerted, the relentless leverage he wielded, started to notice the silence. The calls from me became less frequent, and when they did come, they were brief, professional, and utterly devoid of any emotional resonance or pleading undertones. My responses to his increasingly probing questions about my finances became progressively vague, almost dismissive, designed to offer no leverage. I would simply say with a measured calm, "Things are progressing as planned," or "I'm focusing on the long term," words that offered no opening for his usual financial pronouncements. The real impact, however, began to manifest not in direct confrontation, but in the whispers that inevitably started circulating within our extended family and, more importantly, his influential business circle. When people observed my continued professional success, the undeniable stability of my ventures, and my consistently calm, unruffled demeanor, his carefully constructed narrative began to unravel. He had, in his own mind, painted me as a failing son, a financial black hole, a cautionary tale. But reality, as it so often does, painted a vastly different picture. My businesses weren't collapsing under financial strain. They were thriving, albeit now under new, independent, and more resilient structures. My lifestyle, while admittedly more modest in its outward appearance, was demonstrably stable and imbued with a new sense of purpose. The social consequences for my father were subtle but significant, like a slow erosion of prestige. The pride he'd always taken in his immense financial prowess and his ability to control outcomes started to be tinged with a faint, almost imperceptible embarrassment. He had sought to exert absolute control through financial leverage, and in doing so had inadvertently revealed a certain possessiveness, a fundamental lack of faith in my own capabilities, a deep-seated need to micromanage even my adult life. When he would attempt to subtly imply my supposed financial difficulties to others, hoping to bolster his own narrative, he'd be met with polite smiles and nods, but the underlying sentiment was clear to anyone who observed. They saw the successful, independent man I had become, not the indebted, struggling son he desperately wanted them to see. My mother, caught in the middle of this protracted familial struggle, found a quiet, palpable relief in the gradual de-escalation of the tension. The constant, oppressive anxiety that had permeated their home, their very relationship, began to dissipate, replaced by a more comfortable, familiar equilibrium. She started to confide in me more openly, her voice laced with a soft regret for the pressure she'd felt compelled to apply, a pressure exerted under his influence, but also with a quiet, profound understanding of my own difficult position. Her empathy was a balm. My father never directly apologized. He wasn't that kind of man. He didn't have to. The quiet shift in the family dynamic, the subtle reassessment of his own perceived authority, was his consequence, a consequence he could likely feel but not articulate. He saw with his own eyes that his attempt to control me through harsh financial demands had spectacularly backfired, not by making me crumble under the pressure, but by forcing me to build an impenetrable fortress around myself, a sanctuary of my own making. The demand had been met, not with a desperate handout, but with a dignified, almost serene detachment. He had demanded payment, and I had paid in a currency he hadn't anticipated or understood, my hard-won independence and my long-sought peace. And in doing so I had, in a way that mattered most profoundly to me, irrevocably collapsed the entire edifice of his control. It was finally done.